The History Corner with Miss Hughes. Haha, see me trying to add some personality in here. Okay, so this lecture today is about the Vietnam War from 1955 to around 1975. Now, Vietnam War, right? It doesn't sound like American history. Well, it is, and I would argue it's probably the third most important war in U.S. history. Civil War is probably the first one, then World War II, then Vietnam. Some people say the Revolutionary War is the first one, but they don't know what they're talking about. So make sure as I go through this, you're taking notes. And then if you need to do any outside research based on what I say, do that on your own. Okay, so I don't think we can start the Vietnam War without talking about the Korean War. Keep in mind this time period. So it's during the Cold War, which I'll just ask you a question and hopefully answer it in your notes. Why is the Cold War relevant to the United States? Why would it be a big deal? Okay, so the Korean War was in 1950, or it started. North Korea and South Korea were separated. North Korea pushed past their boundary line into South Korea, which the U.S. aligned with. North Korea was communist, so they aligned with the Soviet Union. So the United States decided to enter the war on South Korea's behalf. Not only did they enter the war, they somehow got away for the UN Security Council to have a unanimous vote to go to war. First time and only time that's ever happened. Okay, so the United States viewed this really as a fight against international communism itself. North Korea wanted to unify Korea, which meant they wanted the whole Korean peninsula to be a communist country. The United States, on the other hand, either wanted them to be separated or to unify Korea to be a pro-US, pro-West country. There was quite a bit of back and forth between the war, and it brought about this fear that China and Russia would get involved, and when you're talking about nuclear weapons, that gets a bit scary, right? So they decided to come up with a resolution, and that's how we have the Korea we see today, where you have North Korea, dictatorship, communist country, and you have South Korea, who is more of a U.S. ally. Great, that brings us into the start of the Vietnam War. So I'm just going to give you some background about Vietnam and why the U.S. would be interested in the first place. So Vietnam was originally, the Vietnam was originally a French colony. Then during World War II, Vietnam was invaded by Japan. After World War II, there was a lot of fights for independence from France, and one of the big leaders in this fights was named Ho Chi Minh. He was a communist, and he was centralized in North Vietnam. Eventually what happened is Vietnam kind of split, and you had communist North Vietnam against South Vietnam, which was more U.S. oriented. Similar to Korea, the goal was to have a unified Vietnam. So it's either unified communist Vietnam or unified Vietnam that was more U.S. West oriented. Here's where the U.S. gets involved. So in 1954, after the Korea War, U.S. got involved after communist forces under Ho Chi Minh took power in North Vietnam. President Eisenhower at the time started by giving military equipment and aid and advice to the South Vietnamese against the Northern Vietnam soldiers, famously named the Viet Cong, or the Vietnam Communists. The thing with this starts with this idea of domino theory, which is if one Southeast Asian country falls to communism, then the rest of them will fall, and the U.S. will lose influence on the Asian continent. That's the foreign policy that dominated the United States through the 1950s till about 1975, and even further on, this idea of the domino theory. So we have three big presidents during the Vietnam War. The first was the very attractive, some say, John F. Kennedy, not Robert. Robert's his brother. His strategy was to give aid and to give, some like air support, give some supplies, but no large-scale invention. He did up the amount of troops that would come in to about 9,000 troops, but still not a full-fledged war. President Kennedy was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became into power. I personally think Lyndon B. Johnson is the best president. I have my reasons why. You can debate me on it later, but he kind of, effed it up with Vietnam. So we'll start that the Viet Cong, or the Northern Vietnamese, started to have military maneuvers and moves against the United States. One thing resulted in the U.S. Navy being bombed. So LBJ created the Gulf of Tonkin, which gave him, as president, and presidents after him in Vietnam War, broad war-making powers. As a result, he increased the number of troops in 1965, first to 82,000, then he sent 175,000 more in. That puts us now at a full-fledged war. President Lyndon B. Johnson also authorized some questionable strategies for the military. One famous one is Agent Orange. It's a very toxic and dangerous herbicide, so it kills plants. The U.S. Army would drop that on forests in Vietnam to sort of destroy the forests and eliminate cover for the Viet Cong. Vietnam is still dealing with the repercussions of this herbicide being used. The last president to focus on is Richard Nixon. He had this thing called Vietnamization. So Lyndon B. Johnson messed up Vietnam. He stepped down as president. People were pissed. And Nixon said, okay, we'll withdraw troops. We'll increase U.S. military presence in the air, and we'll help South Vietnamese with training. This was his policy, but in reality, he didn't quite do this. There was still a lot of troops in Vietnam, and it was really hard just to take them out. And as a president, he was fully committed to winning that war. Because Vietnam was such a huge war, the U.S. had to turn to a draft. 2/3 of the troops in Vietnam volunteered. 1/3 of them came through the draft, and it was called something like the lottery. So you'll see that picture above where the guy looks like he's rolling something. This is real. It happened on TV. They would put numbers in there, and they would roll it, and if your birth date came up and you were 18-year-old male or older, you would have to go to the draft. Ways to avoid the draft would have been if you were educated, or if you were well known, so you could convince the draft board not to draft you, or if you had some medical reasons not to go. So as you can imagine, upperclassmen did well avoiding the draft. Any middle class, lower class, working class men, unfortunately, couldn't avoid it. One of the most famous outspoken people against the draft was Muhammad Ali. And you can see his quote there and his picture there. He was drafted, even though he was a famous boxer, to go to Vietnam. And as a black Muslim, he objected. And you can see his quote up there. It's really, truly incredible because it sort of spurs this protest that's happening at the time. You would also have a lot of other people avoiding the draft in various ways. So people would leave and go to Canada, or people would lie about their medical conditions, or back then the military wouldn't enlist you if you identified as being gay, so they would say they were gay, right? Crazy stuff, but that's where we're at with the draft. That's why it's a big deal. The draft actually technically was abolished in 1975. That being said, you still, at 18 as a male, have to say like, yeah, you can have my information, just in case there ever is a draft. The other interesting thing about the Vietnam War is that it was the first television war. The war was highly televised. People could see it in their own homes. Initially, it was upbeat, sort of like, oh, look at what these troops are doing in Vietnam, yada, yada. But eventually, the news started covering all of the violence that was happening. And you would see, like, troops killing people on TV, which is a really, really big deal. The idea was people were starting to see how crazy it was there. There were a lot of protests starting at home about the war, so the news kept playing what was going on. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's pretty unprecedented even today, where like we have access to so much information with television, with internet and everything. We don't really see much of what U.S. troops are doing in their conflicts overseas. Okay, so due to television, the draft, all kinds of things, there were massive protests against the Vietnam War. Some of the big events that caused this, first was the My Lai massacre, where it was caught on television of soldiers killing 400 unarmed victims and citizens in a Vietnam village. After that, about 250,000 people went to go demonstrate in Washington, D.C. and protest the violence. The idea behind it is the draft is unfair because it was unfairly recruiting the poor. The government had unchecked authority in their war, and the purpose for the war was really vague for the people. Protesters would also help draft dodgers. It was pretty heated. Like, I don't know if you understand how insane these protests would be, but a lot of people would get beat up, would die kind of thing with them. Two examples of this are at Kent State and Jackson State University. Students that were protesting were killed. 4 at Kent State, 2 at Jackson, which is pretty crazy. Okay. All right, so when does the U.S. leave the war? Technically, the Vietnam War ends in 1975. U.S. troops leave because they realize they cannot win, and almost immediately after, North Vietnam captures Saigon. That means that Vietnam became a unified communist country, and that's how it still is today. It's not super communist anymore, but it's still under the foundation of what North Vietnam did. The effects of this war for both Vietnam and for the U.S. is insane. So some big effects, there were 2 million Vietnamese killed, and 12 million Vietnamese refugees. The U.S. spent about $120 billion for this war, and as a result, the 1970s inflation is because of all the government spending. And the biggest thing is veterans started to come back with record levels of PTSD, alcoholism, and drug abuse. So the fact that the war was so huge really affects the U.S. today and the way that, the baby boomers kind of view going to war. Okay, the last part of this is who fought. So people were drafted, the U.S. was involved in it. But the other part of this war that makes it real tricky and really crazy for history is a majority of the men that were sent there came from farms or they were working class. 25% were poor, 55% were working class, and 20% were of middle class. You had little to no upper class men. Similarly, if you were in college, you would not be drafted. So what you're looking at is a bunch of people who would be considered uneducated or unlikely to get an education at college forced to Vietnam. And as I said before, they would come back with record levels of PTSD, alcoholism, and drug abuse. And that sort of perpetuated their circumstance. So a lot of the reason why people strongly disagree, dislike, hate the Vietnam War was the fact that it was the poor that fought that war. Okay, hopefully you liked this lecture. The Vietnam War is really complex and interesting, so feel free to look up more to figure out what exactly happened there. There's also a lot of music with it, so feel free to look up some music, some folky stuff, that goes on with it. I was going to play you something to end it out, but I forgot, and now it's too late, so maybe I'll play something in class. Okay, see you all later. Bye.